Hey guys, the climb has been going well. What am I at? 258 LP. Not too bad, not too bad. Um, but anyways, I wanted to talk about complexity creep, which is crazy issue in League of Legends, especially for newer players or players who aren't spending so much time playing the game as I am. And you've probably heard of the term mobility creep, which is the idea that as they release new champions, they become more and more mobile in an attempt to make them more interesting and different from older champions. And I actually think that while mobility creep is a huge problem, it actually stems out of a bigger problem with releasing new champions in a game where there's already 160 plus champions, which is complexity creep in general. And basically, the idea behind complexity creep is that when you already have so many champions that exist in the game, how do the people designing champions create a new champion that's actually interesting and different than the old champions? Without overcomplicating the game? And the answer is that they really can't. And so when I was learning the game back in my day, there were like 50 champions or something like that in the game. And that was hard back then for me to learn what all the 50 different champions did. But nowadays, newer players or players who are still learning what all the champions do are having to deal with 160 plus champions. I think we're all the way at like 169. We're almost at 170 champions here. And for all of that, what we've gotten is more and more complex champions. So it's not even like they have 120 extra champions to deal with than when I was first coming into the game back in like the end of season 2 and season 3. We're actually dealing with even more complex champions. So maybe you're dealing with 120 champions that are twice or three times as complex as the champions that I was learning back then. So that's a real issue. The other thing is it creates a problem in terms of visual clarity because most people don't actually bother to read into specifically what a champion can do or to play a game on every single champion in the game. Even to go into a practice tool game on every single champion would take a long time. I mean, even if it just took like 5 minutes for each champion, when there's almost 170 champions in the game, you're going to be taking like an astronomical amount of time just to go into practice tool for 5 minutes with the champion. So obviously most people learn what every champion in the game does by maybe watching the champion spotlight and then forgetting half of what they watched, especially when they're remembering a champion spotlight from 10 years ago, or they you know and this is how most people genuinely learn what champions do, from playing against them in the game. And the difficulty is that when you have these complex champions that have a lot of passives, that have 3 paragraphs about how the ability works, you can have that ability fired at you 10 times and still have no idea what's happening because the champion is so complex that you just don't get enough visual information about what's going on. And I'm not even talking about just passives and and things of that nature that are kind of impossible to figure out unless you're reading into the champion anyways. I'm talking about straight up abilities. Like when you look at Aphelios' abilities and how they interact with each other, and luckily I took Aphelios and played like 20 normal games on him to figure out what was going on with that champion because that was a crazy one. Like you could be a silver player and be trying to learn what's going on in the rest of your game, and you're half focused or 90% focused on learning your own champion, let alone you've got this champion comes into the game like Aphelios, where he can throw his ability down in front of you. He can hit you with his Q, with his green sniper or whatever, and then, he has the purple gun secondary, and so he roots you or something like that, and you have no idea what happened. Or, sometimes he'll have a different gun with it, and something else will happen. And there's so many combinations and possibilities that you just kind of can't tell what's going on, especially when you're paying attention to other stuff and trying to play the game and survive and dodge abilities and win the game and look at the map and stuff like that. And so my problem with this complexity creep is that I think it makes the game exceedingly difficult for newer players to learn because they're coming in and they're having to go through such a massive amount of information, it's not really worth it. And people say that, well, for an older game that has existed for 10, 15 years, that's kind of part of the difficulty of coming into an older game where people have been playing for a long time. They're going to know more than you. And certainly that can be true, but let's compare it to another very long living game like Counter-Strike. Counter-Strike is not that I'm not saying the game's not that complicated, but the knowledge that you need about how the guns work, for example, is way less complicated than the 170 champions that there are in League and what their 700, 800 abilities and passives all do down to the third paragraph, right? You don't need three paragraphs to explain how an AK-47 works in CSGO. Maybe as somebody who's not as proficient as CSGO, I'm underselling it, but in my opinion, a lot of the advantage that players who have played CSGO for 15, 20 years have is that they are better mechanically and that they have knowledge about how to play situations and maybe how maps work and stuff like that newer players don't have. In League, it's so complicated that I don't feel like it's viable for new players to come in and even feel like they have a chance at learning the game. So I don't mean to undersell CSGO with that. Much respect to the CSGO people, but the point is that in an attempt to create and one-up their older champions, Riot has made the game way too hard to learn. And that's a big problem because we know that the player numbers are not looking so hot right now. The reality is that LCS has probably lost just an insane amount of viewership. We're looking sometimes at like 50,000 to 25,000 people watching the regular season LCS games. And I can tell you from personal experience that on Twitch, it used to be more like 100,000, 200,000 people watching. So that is a very significant multi-fold drop in viewership for the LCS. Now, for the game itself, I can also tell you from experience that you can go to op.gg, you can go to leaderboards, and you can see how many people in each region have been completed their placements in rank. Now, obviously, some of these accounts are even duplicates, so this isn't even the true number of players, which would be much smaller. But there used to be 2 million accounts ranked in NA, and we are sitting around 1 million today. So it's no joke to say that the league is undergoing a serious player base decline in North America. Now, it's still growing in Korea and in China and holding steady in Europe, and it's growing quite strong in some new minor regions like Brazil and other minor regions that are popping up where there are new servers and things like that. It's growing in Japan. They just put a new server in the Middle East, so obviously it's growing there compared to zero before. But the reality is that at least in NA, a lot of the player base is aging out of the game, and there aren't new young players coming in and replacing the older players because the game isn't very accessible to new players because of how complicated it is. So why is Riot continuing to release so many new champions and making them so complex? Well, obviously they have to release new champions because they can guarantee a new skin for that champion. A lot of people will buy the champion right when it comes out, potentially buying the champion or the skin or both. And so it's a great way to make money. And it also provides a champion that is going to have new skins possible to be released for the champion into the future. And so when they switch people from maining, a champion from 10 years ago to this new champion, when people switch, now they got to get the skins for that champion. And in addition to that, it creates some interest. People come back to the game and they, want to see what the new champion is like, et cetera, et cetera. It keeps the game exciting, keeps current players from getting bored because there's a new champion in the game and a new challenge to face up against. So we get why they release a new champion. And obviously, Riot has slowed down drastically the number of champions that they're releasing. But it is a bit of a difficulty, right? Now, as to why they keep getting more complicated, I think it's a pretty straightforward answer. Whenever you see a new champion come out, they're always compared to an old champion. And so people say, this new champion's Q is like this champion, and this new champion's E is like this champion, and their ult is like this. And so it's a bit like in music where, whenever a musician creates new music, people immediately start comparing them to the most similar band to them and saying that, they sound like so-and-so. And it can be very annoying because as a musician or as a music group or a band, you don't want to be compared to some other band. Even if they were an influence, you want to make sure that you have your own sound and your own style. In the same way, the Riot champion designers are basically saying, I don't want to design a champion that's just a cookie cutter carbon copy of some champion that already exists in the game. I want to design something new, something fresh, something that challenges players, something that doesn't exist in the game. But I think that this misses the point a little bit. Believe it or not, I don't think as many people play champions because of the way their abilities are as they do because of the theme of the champion and what the champion is like as a character. Even for me at a high level, playing a champion like Braum, there are other champions that I think are better in the meta, other champions that I might even enjoy their abilities more, but I play Braum because thematically I enjoy the champion very much. This is true for most people. You see a lot of women playing League who choose to play female characters, and guys playing League choosing to play male characters. And you don't tend to see a ton of crossover. Obviously, AD carries tend to play some female champions, but that's just because most AD carry champions are female. So you do see people picking champions and deciding what champion to main for completely different reasons than just the abilities. And sure, if you're going to put a new champion in the game, it does feel a bit cheap or like a waste of an additional champion, when you're adding complexity to the game just in the nature of adding a new champion to the game. It does feel like a waste if you're just putting four abilities that already exist in the game together with each other. But you could, if you wanted to, get away with releasing a new champion that has abilities that are easy to understand, simple, and very similar to other things that already exist in the game, but is so different thematically, and provides a new character or personality type that people want to play, that it could be successful regardless. And so I do think that it's a bit of a mistake to over complexify champions. This brings me to my last point, which is visual clarity is very important, because think about how people learn new champions in League and the way that they work and their abilities. I think if you ask most people, they will tell you that maybe I watched the champion spotlight, but for the most part, I'm not going to remember every detail of the champion spotlight, and I mostly learn what new champions do by playing against them in my games. And so visual clarity is of the utmost importance when people aren't going to sit through a Wikipedia article to learn how the champion's abilities work. Most people aren't going to take the time to take the champion into a practice tool game to learn how they work and read all their abilities in game. Most people aren't going to have the time to play a full normal game or ranked game or whatever on a new champion. And so what's going to happen is that players just aren't going to learn how they work, because you'll release a champion that's so complicated and has so many passes and has a 3 or 4 paragraph passive that basically nobody has any clue how they work until they've played against it way more times than they used to have to play against champions to learn how they work. So you used to play against an Annie back in season 3, and you played against Annie a couple of times and you knew what Annie did. Try playing against Aurora or, any of the new champions that exist in the game today, and tell me that even as a high level player like myself, I, read the information when it was released. I watched the champion spotlight, and I go into game and I play against the champion, and I'm supposed to know how that ult works, and I still don't understand how that ult works. And I'm not saying that you should understand every champion instantly before you even play against it, because of course part of the fun and part of the point of releasing new champions is that they add a bit of a challenge for players, that they add, give you the sense of mystery from when you didn't remember how the game worked and you needed to learn what a champion did. So I get that all of that is a good challenge and that that's part of the game. But if you make them too complex to the point where people can't learn what the champions do from playing against them 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, well, you have to understand that most casual players who are playing a normal game or two, maybe playing a ranked game every once in a while, I know from experience and from talking to a lot of players on this channel, people are not playing the game enough, especially now. They're not playing the game enough at a low level to be able to learn what these champions do, because to play against Aurora 10 times is going to take you maybe, 400 games or something, maybe more. And those players aren't going to get there for years. They're not going to play against her that many times for years. And Aurora may not be even the best example. I actually feel like Aurora came out with a moderate, kit in terms of complexity that was not crazy or anything like that. But just the fact that I believe that that's the case will tell you how crazy some of these other champions are that have come out. So I think that they're making the game too difficult to learn, and we have some serious player base issues to contend with. Like I said, we've seen the player base drop rather drastically. And so I think that Riot needs to focus on either slowing down the release of new champions to combat the complexity creep in the game, and therefore mobility creep, because mobility creep, like I said before, is really just a piece of this bigger problem with complexity. Because if you give a champion more mobility, they become different than other champions that aren't able to be that mobile. And it makes the champion unique or more skillful, or you can do more with the champion, therefore more complex than it used to be. So Riot needs to either tone it back with the champion releases even further, or they need to design champions that still manage to interest players and provide a bit of a challenge, and who are very unique thematically, but are not so crazy in terms of complexity that a player can't learn how to play against them, and what their abilities do after playing against them, five plus times or whatever. That's, it's too many games. A player won't learn how to play against it for years at the rate that a lot of lower ranked players or normal game players are playing the game. So hope you enjoyed the video. Good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.